Break her leg, Zach. Drop her. This is going viral statewide. That piercing scream blasted through the PA system, driving straight into my eardrums. It didn't come from an enemy across a blood-soaked field. That call for murder spit right out of my own mother's mouth. On the red mats, Zach, the little brother I used to carry on my back, the kid I bled myself dry to teach how to throw a punch so he could protect himself, was charging at me. 200 pounds of pure muscle closing in. He looked at me, a vicious smirk twisting his face, his eyes drunk on the promise of internet fame. "Don't cry now, weakling," he hissed. At that exact second, Zach's foot swung up, launching a brutal oblique kick aimed dead center at my left knee joint. A forbidden move. A dirty strike designed with one single malicious purpose: to tear my ligaments to shreds and permanently end my career. I had been naive enough to believe in the word family. I had constantly backed up, taking hits for 10 straight minutes just to play nice and save my brother's face in front of thousands of livestream viewers. In return, my own flesh and blood treated me like a sacrificial lamb for some cheap, dirty marketing trick. Zach's foot cut through the air, stopping exactly 2 inches from my knee. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the snap of bone. My mother smiled radiantly, shoving her phone camera right into my face. And in that cruel defining fraction of a second, the blind devotion to my family shattered into dust. I stopped being a big sister. The air pressure in the room plummeted, turning freezing cold. The passive look in my eyes vanished, replaced by the dead silence of someone who tears people apart for a living. I shifted my hips exactly 15 degrees, and it took me precisely 1.5 seconds to completely dismantle this man. But before I show you how those 1.5 seconds crushed Zach's ego into the dirt, we have to rewind a half hour. Let's see exactly how someone who survived the worst things in the world voluntarily walked right into a death trap just because of the word family. I pushed open the heavy glass door of Apex Combat. The bitter Lake Michigan winter wind howled, clinging to the heels of my mud-caked work boots as it chased me inside. The door clicked shut, cutting off the storm, but the environment inside was worse. The heaters were cranked up to the absolute max. The air felt thick, suffocating. A cheap, overwhelming pine air freshener fought a losing battle against the sour stench of spilled champagne and stiff hairspray. People in sharp suits and expensive dresses crowded around the makeshift bar, laughing too loud. I reached up, brushing a clump of melting snow off the shoulder of my faded gray hoodie. The elbows were completely worn thin. I bought it at a dirt road gas station 4 years ago. A guy in a tailored blazer brushed past, slamming his shoulder hard into mine. His drink sloshed onto the floor. He didn't even look back. Not a single person offered a greeting. My hands, rough and calloused with old burn scars, dug deep into the pockets of my damp jeans. I stepped out of the way, pressing my back against a cheap plastic trash can near the entrance. I just stood there, quiet, staring at the shiny new empire I had paid for with 3 years of my life freezing in the dirt. Evelyn emerged from the crowd. My mother. She wore a tight emerald silk dress. A heavy gold-plated watch caught the harsh overhead lights on her wrist. She walked straight toward me. No hug, no smile. Not a single word asking about my miserable 6-hour flight back home. Her eyes immediately dropped, scanning me from the top of my messy bun down to my wet, dirty boots. Her painted eyebrows pinched together in deep, unapologetic disgust. Marie, I told you to buy a decent jacket for tonight." Her voice was a sharp, grating hiss meant only for me. "Stand over in that corner by the coats. Don't block the photographer's frame." She reached out. Her thumb flicked a speck of lint off my collar, a mechanical, lifeless gesture. Then she pivoted on her heels, raised her champagne flute, her acrylic nails clicking against the glass, and drifted toward a group of wealthy-looking parents waiting to pay their kids' monthly fees. I watched her back disappear into the sea of fake smiles. My throat felt like dry sandpaper. I shifted my gaze to the main training floor, 1,000 square feet of bright red foam mats. 6 premium cowhide heavy bags hung from reinforced steel racks. A massive neon sign pulsed on the back wall, flashing the word Apex in blinding crimson. My brain didn't see gym equipment. It saw numbers, automatic brutal conversions, the red mats, 2 full months of hazard pay. Those leather bags. 5 graveyard shifts in 10 below zero weather. That blinking neon sign. The exact amount of my medical compensation check after my knee cartilage tore. My family treated those monthly wire transfers like a God-given entitlement. A bottomless ATM. They drained my bank accounts and used my sweat to build this flashy high-end kingdom. And in this kingdom, I didn't even have a folding chair to sit on. I stepped further back into the shadows near the reception desk. My eyes started moving, an old habit I couldn't turn off. Scanning the room, dividing the space into a grid. 2 o'clock. A smartphone mounted on a heavy-duty tripod. The red recording light was already blinking. 10 o'clock. A DSLR camera clamped tight to a steel crossbar angled downward. 6 o'clock. 3 guys in black t-shirts holding expensive gimbals pacing the edge of the red mats. I stopped breathing for a second. I looked closer. None of them were filming the party. They weren't pointing their lenses at the people drinking or the kids laughing. Every single camera was locked dead center on the empty training mat. A massive, multi-angle live stream network, already running. My eyes narrowed in the dark. The cheap champagne, the fancy suits, the fake smiles. This anniversary party was just a hollow front. The trap was already set. They just needed someone stupid enough to walk into the frame. The crowd parted. Zach stepped right into the center of the red mats. He pulled off his shirt, tossing it carelessly to a corner. He wanted everyone to see. 200 pounds of heavily tattooed supplement-inflated muscle under the harsh glare of the overhead lights. He paced the mat, throwing wild punches into the empty air, letting out these guttural, meaningless grunts. The parents clapping around the edges loved it. The younger students stared at him with absolute worship. He waved a kid forward to assist. A skinny teenager. Zach threw a heavy hook punch at the boy's padded target. It hit with a loud, fleshy smack. The crowd cheered. I just stared. The punch had power, sure, but his footing was completely wrong. His elbow swung too wide. His entire ribcage was left wide open. A fatal mechanical flaw. But in this cheap commercialized gym, no one noticed. They just saw the muscles. They just heard the noise. The blinding lights of the gym suddenly blurred. My mind slipped back 15 years. A damp, freezing garage. The sharp smell of motor oil and rusted tools. The wind whistling through the cracked wooden walls. Zach was 13 back then. Skinny. Crying. His face bruised purple because the older kids cornered him at the bus stop again for his lunch money. I was 20, leaving home the next morning for basic training. I sat on a plastic bucket tearing strips of black electrical tape with my teeth, wrapping it tight around both of our bleeding knuckles. I grabbed his arm, pushing his elbow tight against his ribs. Keep your center of gravity, Zach. This fist is to save your life, not to hurt people. Real strength is knowing when not to swing. His tears hit the cold concrete floor. I stayed up all night teaching him how to survive. A loud thud pulled me back to the suffocating heat of the present. The teenager on the mat had stumbled backward. Zach didn't step back to let his student recover. Instead, he lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight over the kid, slamming the side of the boy's face into the foam mat. Zach wrapped his thick arm around the kid's neck, sinking in a choke. Completely unnecessary. A vicious, ego-driven display of dominance. The teenager's face turned deep red. His hand slapped the mat over and over, begging for him to stop. Zach let go. He laughed, standing up and brushing non-existent dust off his shoulder. See that? Zach sneered, playing directly to the cameras. There's no room for weak defense. Out there, you're either a wolf or you're a sheep. The crowd erupted in applause. My chest tightened. He took the very survival tools I bled to teach him in that freezing garage, and he twisted them into this ugly, cheap bullying tactic. He was parroting trash he heard on some alpha male podcast. He wasn't teaching. He was feeding his own massive ego on the backs of kids who were just like he used to be. The teenager scrambled off the mat, holding his throat, coughing hard. Zach still wasn't satisfied. He needed more. He needed absolute submission for the live stream. His eyes scanned the room, hunting. He lifted his chin, pointing a thick finger toward the far corner. You. Yeah, you. Get up here. Let me show you what real power looks like. The crowd shifted, parting like the Red Sea. Lily Thompson, 19 years old, barely 100 pounds soaking wet. She shrank back, clutching her jacket tight against her chest, her ponytail shaking. Slowly terrified, she took her shoes off and stepped her bare feet onto the edge of the red mat. My stomach dropped like a stone. A perfect piece of prey had just been selected. Lily stood there barefoot on the cold foam, trembling. She raised her hands in a loose, awkward guard, pulling her oversized jacket tight. She couldn't have weighed more than 95 pounds soaking wet. Zach didn't slow down. He didn't bother explaining the technique to the crowd. He didn't move at a careful demonstration speed. He just exploded forward. 200 pounds of raw supplement-fed muscle launching directly at a terrified college kid. He hooked his thick left foot behind her ankle and drove his heavy right shoulder straight into her sternum. An absolutely absurd, brutal mismatch. Smack! The sound was sickening. A hollow, wet thud of her fragile frame slamming hard against the thin foam covering the solid, concrete floor. The violent impact forced all the air out of her tiny lungs in one sharp, jagged wheeze. She lay flat on her back, staring blindly at the ceiling. Both hands clutched her chest, gasping for a breath that just wouldn't come. That should have been it. The end of the cheap show. But Zach dropped his massive frame down right on top of her. He slammed his right knee hard into her ribs to pin her, crushing her lungs under his entire body weight. His thick, sweaty hand twisted the collar of her cheap uniform top, pulling it violently across her throat, digging deep into her carotid artery. "This is the price of weakness," he barked at the cameras, spitting as he yelled. Lily's face shifted into a terrifying shade of bruised purple. Her eyes went wide, completely panicked, darting around the room for help. Tears streamed down her temples, soaking into the expensive red mat. Her tiny pale fingernails clawed desperately at his thick, hairy forearm, scraping for air, but he didn't budge. He just grinned. Not a single person in that suffocating room said a word. Nobody stepped forward. The mothers in their tight dresses just took a collective step back, holding their smartphones higher to get a better camera angle of a teenage girl crying and choking. The heavy-set dads standing by the coolers nodded along, sipping their stale beers like they were watching a Sunday football game. An old, deep rage flared up in the center of my chest. I bit down so hard my jaw physically ached, the joints popping under the pressure. My scarred knuckles turned stark white inside my damp hoodie pockets. Breathe in for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. I forced my racing heart rate down. I shifted my weight onto the balls of my heavy work boots, sliding my right foot back half a step. The rubber sole squeaked quietly against the floor. I couldn't just stand in the shadows anymore. I was not going to let this arrogant punk crush a kid's windpipe just to build up his fake internet persona. I tensed my legs, ready to launch out of the corner and rip him off her. Before my heel could even leave the linoleum floor, a deafening, high-pitched screech of microphone feedback ripped through the PA speakers. I flinched. The noise nailed my boots to the ground. Evelyn stood dead center on the edge of the mat. She held a wireless mic tight in her manicured hand. "Thank you, Zach, for that excellent warm-up." Her voice was loud, sharp, and dripping with absolute sickening triumph. She threw her arm out, pointing her acrylic index finger straight into the dark corner where I was standing. And now the real main event of the night. Let me introduce to the thousands of you watching on the live stream right now, Delta Force Special Operator Marie Gardner. A blinding white spotlight snapped on from the ceiling, hitting me right in the face. My eyes squinted against the harsh, unforgiving glare. I heard the mechanical whir of the tripods. All 4 cameras instantly swiveled, their dark lenses locked dead onto my chest. The red recording lights flashed in unison. The heavy iron door just slammed shut behind me. The harsh white spotlight burned into my retinas. The shadows that had been hiding me just a second ago were stripped away completely. I was completely exposed. Instantly, dozens of smartphone screens flipped in my direction. The 4 heavy-duty cameras mounted on the tripods blinked their red recording lights in perfect synchronization. Live stream. The word echoed in my head. There was no anniversary party. There was never an anniversary party. My mother had scripted this entire night weeks in advance. She used my hazard pay to buy the red mats and the neon lights, And now she was using my actual life, my reputation as clickbait to feed her golden boy's ego. Evelyn's voice boomed over the heavy bass of the gym's sound system. A real-life warrior, she shouted, milking the microphone for every ounce of drama. The absolute pride of the Gardner family. Let's see if those hardcore battlefield skills can hold up against the pure, raw power of Apex combat. She was hyping me up. But it wasn't out of pride. She was inflating my value as high as it could possibly go. I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was just the final boss in a video game set up perfectly so that when Zach knocked me out, his victory would cause a massive earthquake on social media. She was weaponizing my uniform to destroy me. The crowd shifted, completely cutting off my escape route. The air suddenly felt thick and claustrophobic. The sour stench of cheap draft beer washed over me as two heavy-set dads pressed in from behind. One of them shoved a meaty hand hard into the center of my back. "Get up there, sweetheart. Don't embarrass the uniform." He yelled, his breath hot and stale against my neck. The crowd started whistling, cheering. A wall of flesh and noise closed in around me, forcing me step by step toward the edge of the red mats. If I refused, if I turned around and walked out that glass door right now, I would make this entire family a laughingstock in front of 10,000 people on the internet. The heavy chain of family guilt wrapped tight around my ankles. I couldn't humiliate her. Even after everything, she was still my mother. My calloused fingers grabbed the cheap metal zipper of my faded hoodie. I pulled it down. I slid the jacket off my shoulders and tossed it carelessly onto a cheap plastic folding chair nearby. I missed. The jacket slid off the smooth plastic and hit the floor. A heavy brass challenge coin, a commendation I had earned and brought home specifically to give to her, slipped out of the torn pocket. It hit the floor with a quiet, dull clink and rolled under the dusty table. Nobody looked. Nobody cared. I left it there in the dirt. I stepped up onto the bright red foam. I didn't take off my heavy rubber-soled work boots. I didn't stretch. I just stood there. Dead center on the mat, Zach was bouncing on his toes. He leaned sideways, slapping his heavily taped fists against his own jaw. His eyes were wide, burning with a frantic, ugly thirst for violence. He waved a thick, tattooed arm, gesturing for me to step closer. He smirked, showing off a set of glaringly white, cheap veneer teeth. No referee, no rules. I heard the imaginary heavy iron door slam shut behind my back. Zach didn't offer a traditional bow or a bump of the gloves. He just charged. He came at me like a freight train, launching a massive right hook fueled entirely by the thick muscles in his shoulders. It was a wildly undisciplined swing, but it carried enough raw kinetic energy to easily snap a grown man's jawbone. I didn't raise my arms to block it. Putting my own bone structure in the direct path of 200 moving pounds was a math problem I would lose. Instead, I dropped my center of gravity. My thick rubber boots squeaked against the foam mat as I slid my left foot back exactly half a step. Zach's heavy fist tore through the empty air, missing my cheekbone by a fraction of an inch. The sheer momentum of his own missed punch dragged his heavy upper body violently forward. He stumbled, scrambling to pull his arm back and regain his footing. He was off balance for a tenth of a second, a massive window. But I didn't strike back. The match instantly devolved into a lopsided game of catch. Zach threw dozens of punches, heavy, desperate, ego-driven haymakers aimed right at my head. I moved in a tight, controlled circle. I slipped angles. I dropped my shoulders. Every now and then, my open palm would lightly tap the outside of his sweaty wrist or elbow, using his own centrifugal force to push his wild swings just inches off course. I didn't throw a single counterpunch. Under those blinding overhead lights, looking into his furious eyes, I still just saw that crying 13-year-old kid from the garage. I chose to tire him out. I chose to let him punch the air until his arms felt like lead, hoping he would just stop. But my patience looked completely different to the people holding the cameras. Jeers started rising from the edge of the mat. "Is that all you got, just running away?" a guy yelled. "Crush her, Zach." They didn't understand distance management. They just saw me stepping backward and they assumed I was terrified. Over in the corner, Evelyn was holding her phone up, leaning over the edge of the mat. "Don't give her an inch, baby. Back her into the corner." Hearing my own mother scream for her son to cave my face in felt like a rusted blade scraping directly across my eardrums. Every time I stepped backward to avoid hitting him, the old surgical scar tissue in my left knee flared with a sharp, sickening ache. I was actively swallowing physical pain and taking public humiliation, all just to protect the pride of a boy who wanted to destroy me. Before I tell you how this twisted loyalty finally broke, I need to ask you something. If you are listening to this right now, and you know exactly how it feels to swallow your own pride, to bite your tongue, and take the blame just to keep the peace in your family, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Just type, "I stayed quiet." Let me know I'm not the only one who hurt myself trying to protect the people who were supposed to protect me. By the third minute, my breathing was completely flat, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Zach, however, was gasping. Thick drops of sweat flew off his hair with every missed swing splashing onto the mat. The heavy dark fabric of his expensive uniform clung to his chest. Throwing all that power into thin air was causing lactic acid to flood his muscles. They were locking up. He was suffocating in his own body. But it wasn't his lungs that were hurting the most. It was his fragile, inflated ego. In front of 10,000 people watching on a live stream, the apex predator of the gym couldn't even touch the sleeve of his older sister's dirty flannel. Zach stopped punching. His chest heaved violently. The frustration in his eyes boiled over, turning a deep, bloodshot red. The childish anger vanished, replaced by something entirely different. Something incredibly dark and calculated. He wasn't trying to win a sparring match anymore. He dropped his hands. He took a strange, stuttering step backward. Zach took 2 stuttering steps backward. He dropped his heavy shoulders. His bare foot slipped awkwardly on a puddle of his own sweat coating the red foam mat. He pitched forward entirely off balance. A clumsy, obvious setup. But the brain of an older sister will always fire a fraction of a second faster than the trained instincts of a fighter. I saw 200 pounds of my own blood crashing toward the floor. Operating on pure blind instinct built from carrying him through our miserable childhood, I stepped right into his space, lowering both hands to catch his shoulders. The exact millisecond I opened up my guard, Zach snapped his head up. There was no slip. He wasn't falling. The corner of his mouth twisted upward into a sickening, vicious smirk. He used the momentum of his fake stumble to violently pivot his hips 90 degrees. The heel of his right foot swung up from the floor like a heavy iron axe. This wasn't a standard roundhouse kick meant to score points. It was an oblique kick. A dirty, illegal stomp aimed downward directly at the center of my left knee, right where a thick 4-inch surgical scar cut across my kneecap. It was a strike designed with one single devastating purpose: to hyperextend the joint backwards and tear the cruciate ligaments completely off the bone. He knew exactly where that scar was. He knew what an injury like that would mean. He wanted to permanently cripple me. He wanted to end my career, my livelihood, my entire identity, just to look tough on a smartphone screen. The heavy foot cut through the humid air of the gym. And then a sound drove straight through my skull. A sound piped directly through the wireless microphone and blasted out of the massive PA speakers above us. Evelyn. The woman who brought me into this world. Break her leg, Zach, drop her. This is going viral statewide. She screamed it with absolute unhinged euphoria. That call for mutilation bounced off the mirrored walls, ringing in my ears over the heavy bass of the music. It wasn't just noise, it was a sledgehammer smashing through the very last fragile wall of defense left inside my chest. Time in the room ground to a halt. Everything shifted into slow motion. Zach's heel was exactly 2 inches away from shattering my knee. The fat dads with their stale beers held their breath, waiting for the sickening snap of human bone. My mother was smiling radiantly behind the lens of her iPhone, already counting the likes and shares her daughter's destruction would bring in. A thick, bitter block of acid rose in the back of my throat. Every ounce of patience I had left, every excuse I had made for them, every pathetic lie I told myself about family loyalty. It all turned to ash. I had been bleeding myself dry to protect monsters. The temperature behind my eyes dropped to absolute 0. The big sister who had tied his shoes, bandaged his knuckles, and paid for this entire building died right there on that mat. The person left standing in her place was someone who took people apart for a living. The heavy heel of Zach's foot carried enough force to snap a 2x4 in half. It was aimed directly at my surgical scar. I didn't try to block it with my shin. That was useless. This was no longer a brother and sister fighting in a gym. This was a math equation, 0.1 seconds. I dug the heavy rubber heel of my work boot into the foam mat. I didn't back up. Instead, I pivoted my right foot outward exactly 15 degrees. My center of gravity shifted in a smooth horizontal slide. Zach's crippling kick sliced through the empty space where my knee had been a fraction of a second before. The rough denim of my jeans brushed against his ankle as it passed. All that massive 200-pound kinetic energy suddenly had nothing to hit. His forward momentum hijacked his own body. Zach lurched forward, completely losing his structural foundation. His upper body pitched over his planted foot, dragging him downward. 0.5 seconds. As his chest fell toward me, I moved. My left hand whipped upward like a dull blade. The webbing between my thumb and index finger caught his extended right wrist in midair. I didn't squeeze. I didn't try to outmuscle him. I just gripped the joint, rotated my hips, and violently twisted his wrist outward at a sharp 90-degree angle. I bent the heavy bone structure of his forearm directly against its natural hinge. A sharp, panicked gasp ripped out of Zach's throat. He reflexively tried to flex his massive bicep to pull his arm back. A terrible mistake. By pulling against the lock, he was tearing his own ligaments apart from the inside. 1.0 seconds. Before his brain could even process the burning pain in his wrist, I stepped fluidly into his blind spot. I slid right into the empty space beneath his raised arm. I pulled my right hand back, keeping my fingers pressed tight together. I drove the tips of my fingers straight up into the deep hollow of his armpit, right into the center of the brachial plexus, the dense nerve cluster that controls the entire arm. I dug my fingers in hard like a steel drill bit hitting soft wood. A violent, paralyzing shockwave ripped through Zach's body. His eyes rolled back for a split second. The entire right side of his upper body instantly went dead. His massive tattooed arm went completely limp in my grip, dropping like a torn heavy sandbag. 1.5 seconds. His arm was still trapped tight in my left hand. I didn't give him a chance to breathe. I drove the heavy rubber toe of my boot in a hard, low sweep directly into the back of his remaining knee. His final pillar of support collapsed. Zach fell. 200 pounds of dead weight dropped straight down. Thud. His face slammed directly into the red foam mat. A small, almost invisible cloud of dust puffed up into the bright overhead spotlight. I didn't stand there and watch him fall. I rode his downward momentum all the way to the floor, instantly dropping my own weight right on top of him. The crowd went completely, absolutely silent. The entire process from the moment his foot missed my knee to the moment his face ate the floor took exactly 1.5 seconds. No one holding a smartphone even saw what happened. I dropped my right knee straight down, not on his back, not on his neck. I drove the hardened rubber cap of my knee perfectly into the soft pocket just beneath his floating ribs, directly over his right lung. I put every ounce of my 140 pounds onto a surface area no bigger than a teacup. Simultaneously, my left hand pulled his dead right arm sharply behind his back, twisting the wrist and forcing the joint sharply upward toward his shoulder blade. A flawless, unbreakable mechanical lock. I pinned his heavy chest flat against the thin foam covering the concrete floor. If I dropped my knee 1 more inch, his ribs would crack. If I pushed his wrist 1 more millimeter, his shoulder would dislocate. Zach's face smashed into the mat. The skin on his cheeks instantly changed from a flush, angry red to a bruised, suffocating purple. Blood pooled in his head. His eyes, the same eyes that had looked at me with absolute vicious contempt a minute ago, were now blown wide open in pure, blinding panic. His 200 pounds of gym muscle tensed violently. He thrashed under me, bucking his hips, trying to roll like a fish suffocating on a dry dock. It was completely useless. Muscle mass means absolutely nothing against a perfect system of physical leverage. The heavy, intimidating shell of the alpha male shattered into pieces under the knee of a woman wearing a faded flannel. I leaned down. My face stopped 2 inches from his sweaty ear. I didn't scream like my mother. I didn't yell for the cameras. My voice came out dead flat and hollow like a machine ticking off seconds. "Listen to me," I whispered. Zach opened his mouth desperately, trying to suck in air, but his compressed lung only produced a wet, wheezing rasp. The sour, sharp stench of fierce sweat poured off the back of his neck. I backed up, I said softly. Not because I was weak. I backed up because I still thought you were family. I taught you how to throw a punch so you wouldn't get hurt, not so you could turn into a bully who beats up college kids. He tried to thrash again. I shifted a fraction of an ounce of weight onto his ribs. He froze instantly, a muffled whimper escaping his throat. "You're not a wolf, Zach," I whispered into the deafening silence of the gym. "You're just a coward with muscles." Tears spilled out of the corners of his wide, panicked eyes, pooling on the mat under his cheek. The deep primal terror completely hijacked his brain. He suddenly realized his actual life was resting in the hands of the very person he had tried to cripple just 10 seconds ago. His free left arm flailed out blindly. His heavy hand slapped the red foam mat. Tap, tap, tap. An unconditional, humiliating surrender. Broadcast live in high definition to 10,000 strangers on the internet. Before I stand up and finish this, if you are listening right now and you have ever stood quietly while someone arrogant got exactly what they deserved, if you have ever watched karma deliver the check that someone else wrote, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Just type, "They earned it." Sometimes justice doesn't come from the sky. It comes from us refusing to be victims anymore. I didn't let go immediately. I held that lock for 3 slow, agonizing seconds. I wanted that total physical submission burned deep into the marrow of his bones. I wanted him to remember what real power felt like. Slowly, methodically, I loosened my grip on his wrist. I lifted my knee off his ribs. I stood up, brushing a spot of dust off my jeans, and turned my eyes directly toward the far corner of the room. Toward Evelyn. I stood up straight, smoothing out the wrinkled hem of my faded shirt. A thick, leaden silence choked the entire room. The heavy bass of the gym's speakers had somehow been cut off. The loud, arrogant cheers from just a minute ago were completely gone. The heavy-set dads who had been screaming for my blood took slow, involuntary steps backward, their faces pale. Dozens of smartphones were still held up in the air, but the hands holding them were visibly shaking. Down by my boots, Zach was curled into a tight ball like a boiled shrimp. He clutched his numb right shoulder with his left hand, his face pressed against the expensive red foam. His chest heaved. He opened his mouth and started dry heaving, violently retching spit and stomach acid onto the very mats my paychecks had bought. The raw, ugly truth was finally laid bare on the floor. My eyes swept over the terrified crowd, stopping dead in the far corner. Evelyn stood there, frozen like a melting wax figure. Her radiant, camera-ready smile was completely warped. Her fingers went slack. The wireless microphone slipped out of her hand, hitting the linoleum floor with a sharp, ear-piercing crack of feedback. She opened her mouth, pulling in a ragged breath. She was gearing up to scream. She was about to use the authority of a mother to curse me out, to play the victim, to somehow blame me for humiliating her precious son. But I didn't give her the chance. I just looked at her. My eyes locked onto hers, completely void of any warmth, any fear, or any lingering trace of a daughter's love. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me with the absolute freezing indifference of someone staring at a piece of broken furniture. Evelyn shuddered. She took a step back, her throat snapping shut. Her power over me vanished in that single silent glare. I didn't waste a single syllable on her. I stepped right over the puddle of Zach's vomit, my heavy boots thudding against the foam, and walked straight toward the heavy-duty tripod set up in the center of the mat. The glowing red number on the top corner of the smartphone screen had skyrocketed. 10,000 active viewers. 10,000 strangers had just witnessed everything. They saw the dirty, illegal kick aimed at my knee. They heard a mother screaming for her own daughter to be crippled. And they watched the fake tough guy gym owner get dismantled in 1.5 seconds by a woman he thought was weak. I stopped right in front of the lens. I looked directly into the dark glass of the camera. "This is the reality of using self-defense to bully people," I said. My voice was completely steady, cutting through the silence of the room and broadcasting out to 10,000 screens. "And this is the reality of using your own blood for cheap marketing." I didn't blink. Real strength doesn't need to step on someone else's neck to prove it exists. I raised my calloused hand and swiped hard across the top of the tripod. The expensive smartphone flew off its mount. It hit the concrete floor just beyond the edge of the mat. The glass screen shattered with a sharp, violent crunch, instantly killing the live stream and cutting this toxic family off from the internet fame they craved so badly. "This place," I said to the dead air, "is a joke." I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at my brother. The illusion of the Gardner family was permanently destroyed. I turned my back on all of it, my boots pivoting on the foam, and walked straight toward the dark corner where a terrified 19-year-old girl was still sitting on the floor. I turned my back and walked away. I didn't glance over my shoulder at the mother who had just been stripped of her power, or the brother who was still quietly weeping into the red foam. My faded gray hoodie was still draped over the back of that cheap plastic chair near the door. I didn't pick it up. I left it right there. I left it behind along with every ounce of stupid sacrifice, every quiet moment of swallowing my own pride, and every drop of that toxic, blood-soaked loyalty I had carried for years. That jacket was an empty husk of the big sister I used to be. This suffocating, cheap-smelling room was no longer a place I belonged. I walked straight toward the dark corner where Lily Thompson was sitting on the floor. She had her knees pulled tight against her chest, her oversized jacket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were still wide wet and absolutely terrified as she watched me approach. I stopped in front of her. I reached down, offering my rough, heavily scarred hand to the 19-year-old girl. Lily hesitated for a second. She looked at my boots, then up at my face. Slowly, timidly, she reached out. Her palm was freezing cold against my calluses. I gripped her hand tight, pulling her gently up to her feet. I wrapped my arm securely around her small, shaking shoulders. I guided her forward. We walked together straight through the middle of the crowd. The heavy-set dads and the mothers in their tight silk dresses instinctively took a step back, parting like a sea to let us through. Nobody dared to say a single word. Nobody tried to block my path. The absolute heavy silence of fear paved the way for my final steps out of this poisonous world. I pushed the heavy tempered glass door open with my shoulder. We stepped out onto the concrete sidewalk of the cheap strip mall. The brutal, biting winter wind coming off Lake Michigan smacked me right in the face. It carried a sharp, freezing chill that cut straight through my thin cotton shirt. But for the first time in 10 years, I felt like my lungs could actually expand. I took a deep breath. The freezing air rushed into my chest clean and sharp. A massive shiver of adrenaline ran straight down my spine, washing away a decade of quiet resentment, guilt, and manipulation. The heavy rusting chains of family expectation had finally been snapped in half, broken by my own two hands. "Ma'am." Lily's voice was small, shaking slightly in the cold air. I stopped under the yellow glow of a sodium streetlight in the empty parking lot. I looked down at her. She was staring up at me, her eyes a mixture of deep awe and lingering fear. Could you teach me how to fight like that?" she asked quietly, her breath turning into small puffs of white mist. "So nobody can ever push me around again." I looked at the bruising already starting to form on her pale throat. I reached out, gently smoothing down a stray piece of her messy ponytail. I offered her a small, quiet smile. "Being dangerous isn't a superpower, Lily," I said softly. "It's a heavy weight to carry. I'll teach you how to defend yourself. But you have to promise me you'll remember this one thing." She nodded quickly, pulling her jacket tighter. "True strength isn't measured by how many people you can knock down." I told her, my voice steady against the howling wind. "It's measured by who you choose to protect." Under the freezing, misty sky of Chicago, I finally found my peace. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you found a piece of yourself in these words, or if this story gave you the courage to finally set your own boundaries, please remember that you are never alone. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.